Leo Tolstoy said, "The two most powerful warriors are patience and time. When it comes to interstellar warfare, he couldn't know how right he was." So today, we will be looking at interstellar warfare and the dynamics involved between how two ships would fight while traveling in interstellar space, how you'd move fleets around, and the sorts of weapons people might shoot from their home system to an enemy star system, the interstellar equivalent of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ISBMs rather than ICBMs. This won't be one of our longer episodes, but you might still want to grab a drink and snack, because there's also a companion episode talking more about the science fiction and world-building aspects of interstellar warfare, which I'll mention again near the end. This episode itself is focused more on the known science angles and how it affects the concept of interstellar conflicts. That's a tricky concept too. As I mentioned back in the original space warfare episode, predicting the future of the battlefield in terms of tactics and strategies is almost an exercise in futility, because the dynamics of combat can change massively with a single minor piece of new technology. I've seen that firsthand too. My own unit got in a ton of new gear prior to our deployment to Iraq, a lot of lasers and optics, so unsurprisingly, my unit's leadership decided the guy who had been working on a doctorate in physics before jumping ship to enlist was well suited to figure out how all the new toys worked and train the others with them. New gadgets, no matter how good, are useless if folks don't know how and when to use them. Indeed, they can do more harm than good. But of course, used properly, even a seemingly minor bit of new technology can let you dominate a battlefield. That's the first rule of warfare too, know how to use your equipment. Anyway, I wanted to be upfront about that for today, that we are playing a very big guessing game. To add to that, my own background is in artillery and infantry combat too, not ships. But then modern seagoing Navy ships will likely have far less in common with spaceship warfare than sci-fi tends to portray. Or short form, I don't really know what I'm talking about here, but odds are nobody else does either. All we can do is look at basic physics and military history and try to see what does and doesn't make sense. And of course, the short answer is pretty much nothing we ever see in sci-fi makes sense, though with some weird exceptions. For instance, one of the classic complaints against a lot of old shows is how both ships would just park and shoot at each other at short range. That image is mostly incorrect, though forgivable since spaceship engagement ranges are so big you could never see the ships fighting if portrayed realistically. However, the parking part is partially accurate. Two ships approaching each other at interstellar speeds will only get one short pass with an engagement window that might be as short as milliseconds. They can't loop around for another pass even if they have the fuel, as at 1 g of acceleration or deceleration, they'll need a week for every percent of light speed they were traveling to slow down and speed back up in the opposite direction. However, the opposite case, a stern chase where one ship is slowly catching up on another, would actually seem like a stationary battle, especially out in deep space where nothing seems to be moving. Even at decently relativistic speeds, the stars don't go zipping past like in Star Trek, so you'd still need pretty precise equipment to even measure or shift them over one day. In that case too, we have to remember this is space, not sea or ground. Ships can flip over and even move around side to side or up and down while still carrying that forward inertia, so that to the two vessels involved in that chase, it will just seem like both are mostly parked or just moving around to maneuver. But it is the range of things, even over and beyond what we saw in interplanetary warfare, that makes interstellar combat different. Let's go back to the head-on attack example. Two ships moving toward each other at, say, 15% of light speed from their home systems. We'll say Earth and Epsilon Eridani about 10 light years apart. Either of them would take 70 years to cover that distance, but 35 years into things they'd run into each other halfway between, with a combined speed of 30% of light. The distance between them is going to shrink by 100,000 kilometers a second. Now, most modern ships and fighter jet weapons have an engagement range of less than 100 kilometers, especially for anything not guided, So if that was their window to shoot each other, they'd have exactly 2 milliseconds to shoot as they enter that window, then exit on the other side. That's about 1% of the time a typical human reaction takes place during, and a millisecond is so short it is below the human threshold to recognize. Add to that, if the two survive that first pass with human crews and want to make another, they both need to slam on the brake at 1G, and if they do, 15 weeks later, they can re-engage for a second pass, which is a lot longer than the 15 or so seconds that it tends to take in a sci-fi space duel. Obviously, a human can't handle much more than a G of acceleration for prolonged periods, and a human can't handle millisecond engagements, but a computer can be built to do both. There are realistic limits on how much G-force any complex machine can handle, and it will depend on the weakest link in the ship, but even 10,000 Gs might be plausible. Suddenly a second pass doesn't require 15 weeks, it requires 15 minutes, a 10,000th the time. Incidentally, there's just over 10,000 minutes in a week. Having said that, the amount of power required to generate a 10,000 G turn in a ship of any significant mass will be staggeringly impressive. And again, that would seem to be obvious, what a lot of folks say, that manned spaceships make no sense, and that we only even see it in science fiction because stories not centered on humans are boring to many people to read or watch or play, so we stick crews on ships and pilots in fightercraft to give them a human face. But that's something we'll be challenging a bit today too, at least for a larger vessel acting more like a carrier. Fighters, at least the classic single pilot variety manned by a regular human, are not realistically viable. There are a few things we can say with near certain confidence about interstellar warfare. Direct engagements will be terribly fast, and likely lethal to at least one, if not both parties. Overall battles and wars will be terribly slow, and the energies involved will be terribly massive. Nobody aims for Pyrrhic victories, so those close direct engagements are likely to almost always involve at least one of the combatants only using expendable drones and munitions, while their major assets stay far further back and try attacks and maneuvers that are far less likely to succeed, but also far less likely to get them killed in the process. That's the first rule of warfare after all: try not to lose while winning. Pyrrhic victories aren't. Such direct engagements at speed also leave you no room to follow up if it doesn't go according to plan, all assuming you even survived it. Just as an example, if we assume some 100 kiloton space vessel from the examples we just looked at, something of a mass and size parallel to a modern aircraft carrier, and remembering that the energy goes up with a square of speed, then that ship was carrying about 10 to the 23rd joules of energy, about the amount of energy in all the sunlight hitting the whole planet of Earth over a week's time. So the human crewed one, needing 15 weeks to slow down, will be turning on an engine at least powerful enough to light a whole continent while it slows down. Or alternatively, the energy release of shooting out several megaton-yield atomic bombs every second. This goes with something I've said before in other episodes, that there is no such thing as an unarmed spaceship, and this is certainly true of an interstellar one. When you think of a classic sci-fi manned starship unleashing an orbital bombardment, don't think of it leveling a city. Think more like it was using a machine gun on a planet with H-bombs as the bullets, and probably more realistically, it likely has several of those that it regards as secondary weapons. This is something sci-fi author Larry Niven dubbed the Kzinti lesson for a militant alien race called the Kzin in his known space series, or rather the lesson they learned, that a reaction drive's efficiency as a weapon is in direct proportion to its efficiency as a drive, which can be restated in a more generalized and simplified form as whatever energy a ship has to move itself around represents the minimum destructive power it has available to it. Meaning if the ship in our example rammed Earth, it would hit with a force comparable to the asteroid that is assumed to have ended the dinosaurs, which had thousands of times the total explosive yield of every warhead in existence during the height of the Cold War. Now alternatively, the 10,000 G robot ship will be turning on an engine 10,000 times as powerful, able to light up thousands of planets simultaneously, releasing as much energy every second as our whole planetary economy uses in a year. That's an important thing to consider too, because if you are assuming folks have these kind of energies to give a single ship, then try imagining what their actual economy and population look like. On those rare occasions science fiction remembers the kind of kinetic energy a ship has in terms of planetary destruction, it tends to forget the kind of fortifications a planet could build if it had access to a power source able to run one of those engines. This would not be dozens of defense satellites, each carrying a big particle beam and dozens of atomic warheads, but potentially millions of titanic defense installations, each able to obliterate virtually anything we normally think of as a spaceship in fiction. We've talked about deploying entire stars as weapon systems before. The Nyko-Dyson beam episode covers that. Both the idea of a mega laser able to turn the full fury of a whole star on a distant system, and the alternative of having it use that beam to shove missiles with guidance systems up to relativistic velocities able to arrive as volleys. This is the preferred approach usually, as you can use the solar output for many months or even years to push the missiles launched separately, all at slightly different speeds, timed to arrive simultaneously. These devices, generally known as an RKV or RKM, relativistic kill vehicle or relativistic kinetic missile, or a few other names, essentially the interstellar version of the ICBM, and can include fairly elaborate guidance a laser can't have. What's more, as you get closer to light speed, the kinetic energy no longer rises with the square of velocity, but even more sharply, so they carry an unbelievable punch. Also, while there is no stealth in space, a RKM is very hard to see, and moving so fast that even when you see it, you have little time to react, as the light from it is only reaching you just ahead of the missile. You either detect it during launch or have to detect it by the slight glow of collision radiation with the interstellar medium, which will brighten as it goes faster. The faster something is moving, the less time you have to react to it, and the more energy it has to do damage, but you can also see it further out, and it's even more vulnerable to destruction by some small object just waiting in standby to flick into its path. They can also be manned, since they aren't necessarily accelerating very fast. That seems pretty dark, the notion of a manned missile, but suicide missions are hardly uncommon in war, and finding volunteers generally is not as hard as one might wish it was. Add to that, high-tech civilizations, even if they regard AI as just as human as a human, can presumably find volunteers even more easily, since they can offer to back up or copy the mind of the individual involved. That also has some disturbing implications that get explored in our Book of the Month, Richard K. Morgan's Altered Carbon, that we'll discuss more in our episode on teleportation in 2 weeks. Using the example of the energy in the dinosaur-killing asteroid that hit the Yucatan Peninsula 65 million years ago, it's worth noting that the Sun releases that much energy every millisecond. So a Kardashev 2 civilization with full access to their sun's total energy could be launching such an RKM 1,000 times per second, and would have no problem hurling literally 1 billion of them to hit a neighboring system simultaneously. That's just 2 weeks of solar output. 1 billion missiles, each massing around 1,000 tons, all shoved up to 99% of light speed by giant lasers, all presumably with an advanced guidance system capable of splitting the missile up into thousands, if not millions of sub-munitions, enough to strike every single square meter of a planet with the explosive output of an artillery shell. And again, that's just one of them. They can hurl 1 billion. This is assuming no new technology either. Such a weapon requires huge energy, but it's very simplistic, and these are thus the minimum kinds of attack you need to prepare against. Not a single enemy mothership, not even a decently sized armada of maybe hundreds of ships, but the full and virtually incomprehensible might of a civilization using a whole star to fuel their war machine. Folks often ask me why you'd make a Dyson swarm, since it seems a ridiculous amount of energy and people. But while I think you would fill such a thing up with people eventually, I suspect tapping all that energy would be a high priority even when you were barely at the population needed to fill a planet. Such energy can be stored too, possibly in Kugelblitz black holes, possibly as manufactured antimatter, and, even using a steampunk technology, as trillions of tiny flywheels spun up with that energy just spinning around in space waiting for use. After all, the problem with flywheels as power storage is that air and friction spin them down, which is obviously not a problem in space. We'll be talking about various energy storage options later this spring in portable power, but the key thing is that you can store energy in huge quantities to use. You also, in a high-tech civilization, probably have virtually unlimited effective manpower, since you can not only have robots do most of the work, but tell them to build more of each other instead, then build whatever you need. So when trying to consider K2 or Neo-K2 civilizations, the only kind likely to have most of the normal motivations for war, like resource shortages or border disputes at the interstellar scale, don't just picture vast amounts of rotating habitats or computers or solar power collectors. Think massive factories, many potentially just sitting there doing self-maintenance on an army of robots, and huge energy storage depositories ready to feed those into defense or production. You also probably aren't arriving to attack such a system after years of uninterrupted flight for a final day of encountering resistance. Such civilizations probably have their whole outer solar system, even deep into the Oort cloud, loaded with defense installations hunting for attacks, signs of attack, and potentially ready to respond or retaliate. You also don't want an enemy using the material in your outer solar system to establish a beachhead. Your weapons hardly have to be sheer power either. Odds are good interstellar civilizations are effectively immune to biological and chemical attacks. It's just that the nature of space habitats would make infecting or gassing one very tricky. But even without considering weapons relying on new technology, we have that army of robots issue. If they can build themselves, then they can build ones that can build more, and so on. A single tiny bot covertly deployed somewhere could fairly rapidly build up quite an army, one that grows stronger with each victory. Fighting self-replicating machines in space is a lot like fighting a necromancer. You don't ever want to engage unless you can win, because your lost troops stand right back up again and join in the attack. Now, of course, the first rule of warfare is not to fight battles you'll lose, but a common caveat to that would be that it's the war you don't want to lose, so throwing in on battles where you might lose, or even are sure you will but will delay or distract the enemy, are often okay. Again, not so in this sort of case. You're just feeding them. However, they do need a constant supply of energy to manufacture and replicate, so it's a good idea to have all those resources bottled up and defended. Energy not only provides a potential bottleneck, but a means of easy detection. As I mentioned back in space warfare, there is no stealth in space, but you can get a lot closer before being seen so long as you aren't doing things that require power. Once you start using power, you will light up like a beacon signal. And these same civilizations who can build billions of relativistic missiles can build billions of telescopes and detection devices, so don't expect to sneak up on them. Now, a rebuttal to that would be that this sort of thing only applies to K2 civilizations or those decently near that. But that's pretty much the only kind who will be fighting interstellar wars, or at least one of the two or more involved parties will be. You have to consider the motives to get into such a thing in the first place. Obviously, you need none but survival to be attacked, but someone has to do the attacking. So what were their motives? Were they low on space or resources in their home system? If so, that can only be because they chewed through them or see themselves doing so in the reasonably near future, which means they are a K2 civilization, probably bigger since it's unlikely they have neighbors to fight who aren't their own colonies. Perhaps they want to exterminate all other life. If so, they must be pretty passionate about it to plan out multi-century or millennia purges across huge volumes of galactic space, presumably more than enough to decide to grow their numbers and resources into a K2. But they don't actually need to grow their own numbers either, just tell their robots to grow their numbers. Nothing says a K2 civilization needs to contain a billion people, just that it has the energy and infrastructure able to do so if that was their intent. Maybe they just love war, like the Klingons. Okay, if you love it, you probably make it a focus for your civilization, meaning you probably always want more soldiers and ships, which means you want more people and factories, which means you become a K2. Or maybe they're not aggressive, but they just want to be safe against attack, in which case they become a K2. Any interstellar conflict, particularly if you are limited to light speed or slower, is only happening if at least one of the parties involved is very passionate about it, and in a sustained way. They won't be folks prone to half measures or easily bored, and we have to contemplate that as part of their motives and behavior in a potential conflict. Fundamentally, high-tech civilizations are unlikely to be composed of wimps or idiots. They are unlikely to have ever gotten any technology if they were either after all. And again, they don't have to be numerically expansionist. They could, if they like, just stay living mostly on their homeworld but have a bunch of self-replicating robots stowed away in various asteroids ready to exploit those raw materials in an emergency, and a fair amount of solar collectors and raw materials to build more, with more robots near those, all just patiently waiting for some deep space detector to send the signal of an incoming attack and go into a flurry of self-replication and manufacture. They've got millions of detectors seated out in the depths of their Oort cloud ready to give advance notice to turn those factories on and pump out whole planets worth of defensive gear. An armada approaching an undefended system, detected early, might find that by the time they arrive in system, those robots have converted whole moons into defensive stations and ships. Of course, if you got a swarm of 1,000,000-ton RKVs headed in at 98% of light speed, your signal is only going to arrive a week in advance of them for every light year out you detected them at, so it pays to have a lot of defenses ready. You might ask how the heck you deal with 1,000,000-ton RKVs, each smart and guided, each able to hit with extinction level force. And the answer is with 1,000,000,000 1-kilogram balls able to smack into one. At those kind of speeds, they'd be obliterated. This presumably leads to countermeasures and countermeasures with various point defense systems on the RKVs trying to nail such devices with anti-collision lasers or even smaller anti-RKV devices. But one advantage the attacker has is that they can do a lot of damage just by the sheer amount of relativistic shrapnel and secondary debris left over from their missiles. The sooner out you can intercept that, the wider the cone that debris will cover, and the more time you have to try to clean up that nebula-like wave of deadly space trash headed your way. We discussed the basic concept last week in Orbital Infrastructure, in regard to Kessler syndrome around Earth, and how a scaled-up version is a massive threat to a Kardashev II civilization. And like Kessler syndrome, this doesn't require an intentional attack. One interstellar spaceship cruising into a system and exploding from some engine fault could shotgun a solar system. Such threats are manageable, but only if you've got the infrastructure lying around to handle it. Now, all these concerns only apply if there is some parity in size and technology, which in general won't be the case if it's, say, Earth and one of its new colonies, or rather the solar system versus one, not the entirety of some interstellar empire, due to the huge lag times required just to decide to attack and how. So it's probably more likely to be colony-on-colony conflicts, potentially just two factions in two separate systems, neither of whom is the only nation in that system. In either case, rules might apply, so as to avoid drawing in neighbors who might take sides or intervene, or two technologically maxed out civilizations who originated thousands of light years away from each other, and the defender gains an advantage as they get pushed back towards their more built-up core systems and have more time, relatively speaking, to figure out the enemy's technology and build defenses, while the attacker is increasingly slowed by time lag for new tech, reinforcements, and general coordination from their own home systems. Such interstellar empire-on-empire wars must take thousands of years, both from the space involved and the need to bring along or build your infrastructure in newly conquered systems to progress to attack the next. In-system conflicts we covered in Interplanetary Warfare, and one-sided curb stomp battles we discussed in the Alien Civilization series, which takes considerably longer to watch than such conflicts would tend to last. If an armada from a K2 civilization shows up in Earth orbit tomorrow looking to tussle, we're gonna lose, and very quickly, unless they've got some weird sense of honor where they refuse to land more forces than we have, in which case we'd probably still lose because they are probably all genetically or cybernetically enhanced death machines. I wouldn't like our odds even if they just landed one ship with a single dude that walked out naked with a sharp stick. That's a thing to remember and which we'll explore more in the Planetary Invasion episode, an enemy invading some planet or space habitat might have Marines composed of genetically or cybernetically enhanced super soldiers who don't fear death because their minds are backed up somewhere. However, those civilian targets, composed of normally peaceful inhabitants, might also be cyborged up transhumans, suddenly pumped up with rapidly manufactured weapons and combat software, all with their minds backed up somewhere else too, so they are less worried about death. That same paradigm applies to big classic manned ships too. You have that acceleration issue and reaction time issue, but you could use transhumans instead of AI. And moreover, you shouldn't be engaging at hundreds of kilometers, but more likely at hundreds of millions of kilometers or further. And you probably aren't engaging with one ship or hundreds of ships, but possibly hundreds of thousands of ships. You potentially have large capital ships too, each of which might have thousands or millions of little drones they deploy for the equivalent of fighter attacks or defense screens. Back on those capital ships though, standing off potentially many millions or even billions of kilometers in order to be able to dodge incoming directed energy fire moving at light speed, the real concern on maneuvering is fuel. Far more than how fast they can maneuver is how much total delta V they have for that. The further off you are, the less delta V you need to apply to make sure your ship isn't where an enemy beam was aimed. We discussed the details of that back in Space Warfare, but in short form, it makes classically manned and large ships more plausible again because their constraint is still more about ensuring fuel conservation than how fast they can burn it. That said, the more G-force that ship can handle, either accelerating or turning, the closer it can be in dodge laser or particle beam fire as it randomly chinks around. Of course, that's assuming your ship is solid. It could be composed of lots of smaller bits acting more like cells or liquid. At the end of the day, an AI or cyborg-run ship is still the better option, but the disadvantage is no longer as huge for a manned capital ship essentially acting as a carrier and command and control for a swarm of drones. Most likely you use lots of ships, big fleets, engaging over huge distances, slowly coordinating and maneuvering and inflicting some damage until one side realizes its odds of victory have dropped and peels off to retreat, rather than decisive engagements where both sides take huge casualties. In cases like that, you wouldn't really have ships of the line, our classic term for a line of capital ships engaging another fleet, but more like ships of the wall, a 2D screen, something David Weber uses in his Honorverse series, probably one of the best military sci-fi series for discussing sublight battles and how those might occur, though he's got FTL in there and a type of shields. Any given fiction setting with made-up technology is going to need an entirely different approach to realistic combat, and sadly most don't think a lot of it through. Understandably so. We've barely touched on the topic today, and even then only in the context of known science. We aren't including options like opening a wormhole right on top of your enemy's planet, not to dump soldiers through, but to dump the other end in a sun or black hole. Thinking through what a given hypothetical technology can do is a big aspect of sci-fi world building, and we'll talk about it in the companion video. It's pretty challenging too, and fun. I mentioned back in the Interstellar Empires episode a few months back that one of my side projects to the channel was working on developing the tech and lore for an upcoming video game, Hades 9, and basically to help forge the setting, and said I'd discuss it more down the road. It's also where a lot of the graphics for this episode and some others have come from. That's been progressing, and I suggested we do a walk-up for release by setting up a channel and doing some short videos about not just gameplay, but the setting, its story, and the making of the game. They liked that idea, and we decided to roll a few out to start and add as we go, and they talked me into doing one of them. Not that it was a very hard sell, and I suppose it's really more we these days, but we'll look there more at the concept of realistic world building, especially in the far future. Not so much keeping to known science, but making those necessary departures from science minimal and plausible, and mesh well together without obvious loopholes. That's what I aim to achieve with the Hades 9 tech and backstory set 4,000 years in the future. As I said, that's for the companion episode, and I'll leave a link to that in the video description, on an in-video card, and in the end screen with the credits. Next week, we'll be going even further ahead in time, not 4,000 years, but 4 billion years and further, back to the civilizations at the end of time series for Dying Earth. The week after that, we'll discuss the concept of teleportation and see what options there might be for that under known science. We will then close out March with a look at advanced metamaterials and some of the potentially world-changing applications they have. For alerts when those and other episodes come out, make sure to subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support future episodes, you can donate to the channel on Patreon or by going to the donations link at our website, isaacarthur.net. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit the like button and share it with others. Until next time, thanks for watching and have a great week.